this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate how to solve problems with bind-off edges, whether they are flared or too tight. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. So there are a couple of common problems that knitters can have with their bind-off edge. One of the problems is shown here. So these two swatches were knit with the same yarn and the same needles, and you can see that for this one the cast-on edge and the bind-off edge are shorter than the rest of the fabric. The fabric is kind of bulging out right here because this is how wide it really is, but it's being pulled in by the cast-on and bind-off edges. Whereas this swatch right here has a cast-on edge that has a looser tension, and the bind-off edge is looser as well. The other problem that knitters can have is that the bind-off edge might flare, and you'll see this kind of issue when you've been working in a stitch pattern that has a different gauge than, say, stockinette or garter stitch gauge. The difference between these two swatches is in how I worked the bind-off row. So if we look at the bind-off chains, what we can see is that this one is going in a relatively straight line all the way across. But in this one, you'll see that the bind-off chain is curling. And it's curling and it's undulating in the same way that the fabric itself is undulating. So in ribbed fabric, the knits want to come forward and the purls want to recede, and that's what causes the fabric to pull in. And so with this particular swatch, the way I bound off allowed the bind-off chain to undulate as the rest of the fabric did. But in this one, it did not. And the reason it did not is because when I bound off this edge, I knit every stitch as I went across the row. And so as we've seen with this fabric, stockinette worked over the same number of stitches is much wider. So a row of all knit stitches is going to be wider than a row of ribbed stitches. That doesn't make this edge any stretchier than this one, it just makes it flared. You want to treat all of the stitches on the needle just the same as if you were working a regular row in the pattern. So if you have in ribbed pattern, if you see a knit stitch, you're going to work it as a knit. If you see a purl, you work it as a purl. So these first two stitches are knit. So I would knit them and I would bind one off to pull it over. And then the next stitch is a purl, so I'd move the yarn forward and then I would purl this stitch and then I would pull that loop over. What's happening is that as you work these stitches, they are becoming the last row of stitches below the needle, and the stitches that appear on this needle are what become the bind-off chain. You are not turning these into the bind-off chain, you're turning these into the final row of knitting, and you're turning the new stitches into the bind-off chain. Here I've got a swatch that has cabled fabric that I then transitioned into a seed stitch border, and you can see that in this situation that what happens to the border is that it ripples. So I would have gotten a rippled edge for my bind off even if I had bound off right after this last row of cabling, and that's because the cabled fabrics pull in not just because they are alternating between knits and purls as you do with ribbing, but also because you have stitches that are crossing each other, and that's going to pull fabric in too. So in this type of a situation where we have cable flare, you may need to position your final cable crossing right before the bind off or while you're binding off. And you may also need to work some decreases. So I've done a video on how to handle projects with cable flare, and I'll put a video appearing right here at the top that you can reference for that. One of the problems that some knitters have when they're binding off is that as they're pulling this stitch over the other one, they may feel like things have gotten loose and they habitually pull on the working yarn to tighten this loop. If they pull too much, they're also going to tighten that loop that was just bound off. Because what we can see is if we've got 2 stitches on the needle, if I pull on the working yarn, I can tighten the first stitch closest to the tip, but if I keep pulling, I'll also tighten up the second one. So what you want to avoid doing while you are binding off is to avoid that temptation of tightening things up and keeping things neat by yanking on this yarn. So you want to see, what you want to do is maintain a loose tension on those stitches as you're pulling them off. Now this isn't always possible. For some people it's really awkward to try to get those stitches off. Maybe the yarn is slippery. Maybe they can't help but pull on that yarn as they're pulling stitches off. So one suggestion that knitters are often given is to use a larger needle. So I have a US 7, which is 4.5 millimeters that I was using for my project, but here I've got a US 8, which is 5 millimeters. So that can force this loop to be larger. You could even go up an additional needle size if you have a really particularly rough time avoiding yanking on this. The problem is that you still, if you're pulling on that and you're maintaining this loop size, you could still end up pulling slack out of that stitch that's already bound off. Learning to control your tension is a really good idea, but sometimes it just may not be possible, or you may find that you are not producing really even stitches along the chain. So there's another way that you can get to the same end point, which is to have a chain bind off, but to have one that's more even and that is stretchier. So the decreased bind off is one way of getting to the same end point with your bind off edge, but in a very different way than working each stitch and then passing one over the other. So there are a variety of different ways you can approach this, but this is the way that I think gives the best results. So you're going to knit this first stitch just as you would always. And now you're going to slip the second stitch as if to knit. And now you're going to work these 2 stitches as an SSK or left leaning decrease. You're going to insert your left needle through the fronts of both of them, and then you're going to work them together. Now you're going to slip this stitch as if to knit, and once again insert through the fronts and work them together. And that is what you're doing, slipping as if to knit, enter through the front, work the 2 together. Some people will do a decrease bind off by knitting the stitches through the back loops. So you return that stitch that was on the right needle to the left needle, and you work them through the back like that instead. Again, you transfer and work through the back. The difference between doing it as an SSK and doing it as a knit 2 together through the back has to do with how that final row of stitches ends up getting worked. When you do them as SSK, you get a row of knit stitches. When you work them through the back, what you'll see is the base of these stitches are twisted. If you don't mind having stitches that are twisted at the base, you can work them together through the back if that's easier for you. If you do mind, if you want the stitches to look like a regular row of knitting in pattern, then you can work as an SSK by slipping as if to knit, working the 2 together like that. So as I was doing some research for this video, just to see if there were other approaches to how to do this, what I noticed is that all of the books and the videos that I've seen called for working every bind off as a decrease. That is, they didn't start by knitting that first stitch and then doing the decrease. For all of them, they called for just decreasing the first 2 stitches together. The difference between working that first stitch and then going into the decreases and just decreasing right away is that You end up with 1 row of stitches less in this first column if you just decrease right from the beginning. You'll have the same number of bind off chains, you just won't have the same number of stitches in this column as you would if you work that first stitch and then go into the decreases. If you want to do the decreased bind off on a purl side of the fabric, then again, most sources will tell you to just work the first 2 stitches together as a purl decrease. I prefer to work the first stitch as a purl. Then you return it to the left hand needle and you purl the 2 stitches together. Again, you keep the yarn in front, you return it to the left hand needle, insert through both stitches for a purl 2 together, like that. So let's see how we would do a decreased bind off if we were working in a ribbed fabric. If you wanted to just start off with a decrease, you would look at how the second stitch appears on the needle. This is a knit stitch, so you would start with your SSK. If instead you would like to work that first stitch before you start doing the decreases, then you work that first stitch as it presents. So in this case, I would knit it, and then since this is a column of knits and I want to maintain that, I would slip as if to knit and work the SSK decrease. Now I look and I see, oh, this is a purl stitch, so I need to bring the yarn to the front. I return to the left hand needle so that I can do a purl 2 together. Bring them both off the needle. Again, I have another purl stitch, so return it to the left hand needle, insert, and now I'm going to purl 2 together. Now I've got a knit stitch, so I slip as if to knit and work as an SSK decrease. And I would continue doing that all the way across. So in this case, for the stockinette swatch, I can pull on this, and this does have some give to it, has some stretch to it. It does not stretch as much as the fabric itself can stretch, but it does have some give to it. And the same with the ribbed swatch. The ribbing can stretch quite a bit, and you have a bind off chain that can stretch along with it. Again, the bind off chain is not going to stretch as much as the fabric can stretch, but it does have enough give to work for most types of projects. Today I demonstrated solutions to problems you may have with bind off edges, whether they are too flared or too rigid. Binding off in pattern using a decreased bind off can create even bind off edges with a nice amount of stretch. While this technique will work really well for most projects, it's not going to be adequate for a project where the bind off edge needs to stretch to the limits of the fabric's ability to stretch, as for the cuff of a sock. For those situations, you will need a specialized bind off rather than a bind off with a standard chain edge. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.